Ladies and gentlemen, it's now time for me to switch languages, and I'm very much looking forward to today's opening keynote, which will be dealing with the topic a collective consciousness of the world, tipping point or point of no return. That's the question, and I am very curious to find out if our speaker will be able to answer it for us. She was described by the Sunday Times as an activist, academic, and an aristocrat out to shatter myths surrounding mental illness and psychology. She's an international psychology trauma specialist. She's a founder and director of Fourth Dimension Consultancy with a focus on human rights and mental health through a feminist lens. I'm very much looking forward to welcoming her here on stage. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Anjhula Mia Singh-Bais. Welcome. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So I think, Austrians are very good at speaking impromptu and off the cuff. And I apologize that I wrote a speech. I gave it serious thought because I believe that structure actually leads to freedom. So I want to say welcome. Thank you very much for being here. I am honored to give opening words. We are all gathered here in a pivotal moment in human history. It's a moment where our collective consciousness is faced with a choice. Are we going to tip towards a future of innovation, of justice, of collaboration, or are we going to find ourselves at a point of no return, lost in conflict, division, and stagnation? As immediate past chair of Amnesty International, the world's largest human rights organization, a practicing international psychology trauma specialist, and a consultant to my family's Southeast Asia conglomerate, I think of the intersectionality of these issues often. And of course, as prominent business leaders, oftentimes we think that the bottom line, of course, is profit and money. But I think there's something to be said about the human impulse. So I live in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and I made, of course, the flight to Austria, this beautiful country that I've really come to love. And my layover was in Dubai, and I was taking a bus to a different terminal. And I was actually not seated, I was standing, and the bus, it braked all of a sudden, and I almost went flying. And there's, just so many diverse people, white, black, brown, and their knee-jerk response was to help. They lurched forward to carry me, and that was very moving. I would say that all of us as leaders, our bottom line needs to be to care. That might sound simplistic or obvious, but why I say that is we're at an unprecedented time in history, and there is a lot of compassion fatigue because of everything that's going on in the world. So Vienna itself plays a crucial role in human rights and mental health advocacy. So as a host of the United Nations office at Vienna, it's a hub for international diplomacy, focusing on human rights through agencies, of course, like the UN Human Rights Office. Vienna is also home to the World Health Organization Regional Office for Europe, which addresses mental health issues across the continent. And the city of Vienna is, promoting mental health initiatives all the time, like the Vienna Mental Health Report, where it's integrating mental health well-being into public policy. So, of course, it's a vibrant academic and, research institutions here in Vienna is contributing to global discourse on human rights and mental health. So we are at a crossroads, and the rapid pace of business and innovation has brought unprecedented opportunities, yet it's also presenting challenges that require wisdom, shared knowledge, a global outlook in order to navigate effectively. And I know throughout the day, you'll have workshops and innovation labs, but I would argue that mental health is a nation's wealth. It underlies and underscores everything. Organizations, businesses are fundamentally comprised of people. How we hire, how we fire, how we retain, how do we relate, how do you negotiate, how do you mediate? All of it is psychology. So even as heads of states or ministers and many, of course, ambassadors in the audience, every cabinet, every prime minister, every president should have a psychological advisor. We have learned this very much through COVID. So I just wanted to explore, obviously at the beginning of today, some themes examining how our current state of affairs influences our collective consciousness and the decisions we must take to shape a better future. So Catherine Singh, she's a renowned political scientist whose work on human rights has significantly influenced the field. And she's best known for her research on the effectiveness of international sort of human rights law and advocacy, particularly, thank you, her concept of the justice cascade. And, all of us, whether it's over a coffee or a dinner with family members, maybe on public transport, we're probably prone to say that the world is getting worse. But actually, her research has highlighted how human rights prosecutions and accountability mechanisms can lead to broader changes in global norms and state behaviors, and how actually human rights practices have led to tangible improvements worldwide. Might be a little hard to believe, but the research is there. So what are indicators of a tipping point? It's something that signifies a critical threshold where significant change becomes inevitable and often irreversible. So we hear about tipping points in terms of the climate crisis and climate change, but these indicators can vary depending on the context. So whether it's a human being, a community, an organization, a business, or countries. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about specific tipping points for each context. So when you're talking about tipping points for human beings, they can include things like human exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, persistent fatigue, anxiety, depression, even if you're having rest and relaxation. Behavioral changes, maybe you're working with people where there's just sudden shifts in behavior, withdrawals from meetings, from activities, eating, sleeping patterns, health deterioration, frequent illnesses or worsening of conditions, cognitive decline. I think all of us, especially as business leaders, there's this thing, the concept called existential overhead. So even when you're on holiday, it's always in the back of your mind. There's an email, there's something I need to respond to. And of course, loss of interest, right? Disengagement from hobbies and work. In communities, you might see indicators of a tipping point in terms of increased social tensions, economic decline, health crisis, environmental degradation, political unrest. In organizations, in your companies, tipping points might display themselves in terms of high turnover rates, declining performance, low morale, operational inefficiencies, leadership issues. In business, financial distress, market changes, innovation stagnation, reputation damage, operational challenges. And of course, in the world, tipping points, climate change, geopolitical tensions, economic instability, public health emergencies, and social movements. So what are we seeing all together? The general indicators across all the contexts. We are at the brink of a critical mass, so a significant portion of the population depends, supporting or opposing change. We see rapid acceleration. We see systemic stress where there's overwhelming pressure on existing structures almost to the point of collapse, feedback loops, and also increased connectivity. So it's very important as business leaders to recognize these indicators so as individuals and your companies, you can prepare for and potentially influence the direction of change before reaching a tipping point. Now, I'm going to just say briefly, why can business leaders change the world? They change the world for several reasons. By your unique position of influence, resources, innovative power of the business sector. And I'm sure actually you know this, but sort of putting it down why you literally can change the world. So resource allocation, the human capital, the financial prowess, your R&D investments, adoption and diffusion, job creation, economic growth, of course CSR, corporate social responsibility, and ethical practices. There's also policy influence, right? So lobbying and advocacy. And we've reached quite a place in the past decade. So in the human rights arena, probably a decade before, you know, and I was discussing this last evening at the awards ceremony. A decade ago, the human rights world would probably look at the business sphere with a lot of skepticism. But given where the world is right now, no one can afford to be just highly critical and that's it. Everything that's going on in the world, whether it's war, tension, climate crisis, mental health, it is everyone's issue and we need to join hands. So by leveraging unique capabilities and positions, business leaders, all of you in this room, can enact meaningful changes that really address some of the world's most pressing challenges. So we know that innovation drives progress. From the advent of the internet to the rise of artificial intelligence, all of this has transformed our lives. But I'm here to remind us, in pursuit of progress, we must never lose sight of human rights. And this is just not for activists. I have to underscore human rights for each person, be it a stay-at-home parent or a CEO of a Fortune 100 company. So often we talk about the loss of human rights, but we must remind ourselves of the rights that we're born with automatically. And if this is not preserved and defended, we lose everything. Innovation should never, ever come at the expense of dignity and freedom. If business leaders make this their bottom line, the world will not tip over. And this is how influential you are. New ideas, they must be inclusive, ensuring that all individuals, regardless of race, gender, religion, or background, have the opportunity to thrive. And this is particularly pertinent in the context of ongoing conflicts and crises around the world. So, you know, as such, I really salute Export Day, you know, with the progress on gender. So out of approximately, at last count, 2,200 registrants, approximately 63.9% identify as female. So this is really wonderful. I wanted to just talk about, in terms of some ideas as business leaders and innovation, in terms of combining human rights, mental health, and then making sure we don't tip over negatively. As leaders, you could consider developing a certification program for businesses that ensure you are promoting mental health and respecting human rights in the workplace. This can become a benchmark for consumers and other businesses, encouraging companies to adopt better practices. It could include things like mandatory mental health training for managers, policies that support work-life balance, anti-discrimination policies and practices, and regular mental health audits. You could consider launching social impact bonds focused on mental health and human rights initiatives. Investors could fund programs aiming at improving mental health, and returns are based on the success of these programs. This could include things, for example, like community-based mental health programs, workplace mental health initiatives, and education campaigns on human rights and mental health. You could think about, given the international nature and stature, for example, of this audience, initiating a global campaign advocating for mental health as a fundamental human right. And this campaign could involve partnerships with international human rights organizations, advocacy for policy changes at the national and international level, public awareness campaigns. I think, you know, for example, I met young people today that are shadowing some of the business leaders, and this is very, very important. The leadership pipeline in terms of education. So you could incorporate, for example, mental health and human rights education into business school curricula. Courses could cover the impact of business practices on mental health and human rights, ethical leadership and corporate responsibility, and case studies on successful integration of mental health and human rights in business strategies. The conflict, and I'm actually sort of thinking and speaking about the human condition. The conflict between Ukraine and Russia, for example, is a very stark reminder of the fragility of peace. So, you know, I have flown from Malaysia, and if I've understood correctly, the war is from some parts of Austria only 600 kilometers away. That's very sobering. And it underscores the importance of diplomacy, dialogue, and respect for sovereignty. The international community must work together to support Ukraine, uphold international law, and seek a peaceful resolution to this conflict. The ongoing conflict between Gaza and Israel is another critical issue that demands our attention. You know, decades of violence have led to immense suffering on both sides. And a just and lasting peace requires empathy, dialogue, compassion, diplomacy. Now, of course, the international community, we often think of that as, you know, through our diplomats and ambassadors, heads of state. Yes, of course, they have a role in playing, in facilitating negotiations and supporting humanitarian efforts. But really, I want to say, from what I've seen, you know, being on the ground as a trauma psychologist and doing mediations, business leaders have been able to hold sway with influential backdoor diplomacy. So companies and organizations, for example, implementing mandatory human rights education, diplomacy, and negotiation modules is a way to strengthen your positive impact within and without. And we really need to think about this, because it's not so simple as, you know, once there's a ceasefire, it's okay. I'm very concerned as a trauma specialist what this means for 3-4 generations down the line. This is how traumatized people are. And when there's violence, behind that is anger, behind anger is fear, behind fear is deep, deep hurt. And as businesses, you need to ask yourself, truly, do we want to be a good descendant, or do we want to be a good ancestor? I guess, I'll begin maybe to wrap up about talking about breaking out of comfort zones and inspiring a new generation. So to address these global challenges, yes, we need to break out of a comfort zone. Comfort often leads to complacency, or like I was speaking about in terms of compassion fatigue. But growth happens when we step into the unknown. We need to make that our strategy, fail forward. So whether it's adopting new technologies, exploring different cultural perspectives, challenging outdated norms, we must be willing to embrace change and uncertainty. Every company needs a futurist orientation, which could mean everything from mandatory immersions into wildly different cultures, to diversity, equity, and inclusion certification, what we call DEI. You must make sure not to reduce this to a tick box exercise, but make it your company's DNA. And obviously, I think, you know, maybe a decade before, we probably want our companies and businesses to evolve. But I don't think at this critical time it is about an evolution. It is about a revolution, and business leaders need to lead that. The next generation is watching and learning from our actions. We must inspire them with stories of courage, compassion, innovation. Leading by example and education play a very crucial part in shaping young minds. And so we have to ensure that the educational systems are equipped to teach not only technical skills, but critical thinking, empathy, and global citizenship. You know, for a decent part of my education, I was raised, you know, it was in Asia, which really focuses on sort of rote memorization, which doesn't get you very far. So we really need to tinker with our education system. By fostering a love of learning and a sense of responsibility, we can empower future leaders to create a better world. A global outlook is essential in today's interconnected world. You know, as the recent past chair of Amnesty International, I had 70 country offices. So For example, trying to land a speech that is so acceptable to so many different cultures is an extreme challenge. And people are very, they're very varied and diverse, even within the same country. But I always frame it, and this matters, I always frame it as a challenge, not as an opportunity, not as a problem or an issue. And why do I say that? Because words matter. Words are your wands. So what are we telling ourselves? Words either trigger a subconscious resistance or we embrace the challenge. It's so important, really. What are we telling ourselves? Embracing diversity and advocating for human rights are fundamental to building an inclusive and harmonious society. We have to respect and celebrate our differences while finding common ground towards shared goals. And, I will say that I never want to put sort of civility and unity and sort of place that over justice. But there comes a point where we really, at this tipping point, at the threshold, we need to do things together and bridge divides. So I would say, in conclusion, yes, our collective consciousness is at a tipping point. The choices we make today are going to determine whether we move towards a future of innovation, justice, and collaboration, or we fall to a point of no return with conflict, division, and stagnation. And again, as business leaders, if you make it your DNA, not a nice to have, but a need to have, innovation, human rights, fostering a global outlook, mental health is everything, we can actually navigate all the challenges of our time. These things that I'm talking about today, they can't be ideals or something to consider in the future. If each one of you today went back to your respective country or companies and set out a concrete strategy on how to embrace just two things, really, mental health and human rights, I'm really certain we'd reach a positive tipping point. So I just want to leave you with the following question. What will be more important to you, success or significance? Thank you very much.